In the heart of San Francisco, this story follows Ethan Carter, a man who sees his wife Lily's funeral as the beginning of a new, wealthy life. But his plans are complicated by Rachel Evans, his ambitious lover, and Ben Harper, Lily's devoted nephew, who may know more than he lets on. When a blackmail threat and unexpected revelations surface, Ethan turns to Marcus Lee, a former detective, to uncover the truth. Can Ethan find redemption? Or will the secrets around him pull him deeper into betrayal and regret? The sun hung high over the San Francisco cemetery, casting sharp, relentless rays across rows of headstones and illuminating the mourners who gathered around Lily Johnson's freshly dug grave. Dressed in black, they stood in a quiet circle, their expressions somber as they watched the final moments of a woman taken too soon. Among them was Ethan Carter, standing at the head of the grave with a posture that seemed to exude respect and loss. His face held a carefully crafted look of sorrow, but beneath this mask, his thoughts lingered far from the sadness of the occasion. Ethan's eyes, though lowered respectfully, glinted with something sharper, a cold calculation hidden from those around him. As he looked down at the closed casket, his mind drifted not to memories of his late wife, but to the future that Lily's fortune could open up for him. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he was the picture of the grieving husband, but to those who knew him well, there was an odd stiffness to his sorrow, a lack of genuine emotion in his words. Nearby, Rachel Evans, Ethan's much younger secretary and secret lover, stood among the mourners. Though her face held the appropriate solemnity, her expression was tinged with impatience. She wore a sleek black dress that fit almost too perfectly, drawing a few subtle glances from others. Her dark eyes moved between the grieving faces before briefly meeting Ethan's across the crowd. It was a quick exchange, a glance full of unspoken promises and hidden intent, one that spoke volumes, yet revealed nothing to those around them. She too was here for reasons far removed from grief. Together, they formed a strange pair amid the mourning crowd, one veiled in feigned sorrow, the other cloaked in anticipation. As the priest spoke, offering final prayers for Lily's soul, Ethan's thoughts drifted further from the grave and onto the life that Lily's wealth could bring him. For the other mourners, this was the sad farewell to a beloved woman, but for him it was merely the beginning of a new chapter. The soft murmur of condolences, the scent of marigolds, and the sound of dirt being scattered on the grave all mixed into a strangely haunting symphony. This wasn't just a funeral for Ethan, it was the gateway to a future he'd planned meticulously, hidden beneath the facade of a grieving husband. In the quiet of the cemetery, beneath the heat of the afternoon sun, he concealed his true feelings, already counting on the freedom Lily's absence would provide. But there was a tension in the air, as if the grave itself knew his secret, and it pressed down on him as he stood there, waiting for the funeral to end so his plans could truly begin. As the last few mourners dispersed from the graveside, Ethan's phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw the name Wallace flash on the screen, the attorney who had handled Lily's affairs for years. Stepping away from the remaining crowd, he answered in a low voice. "Mr. Carter," Wallace began, his tone professional but firm. "I'll need you to come to the courthouse tomorrow morning. There's an urgent matter regarding Lily's will." Ethan's lips tightened as he processed the words. He hadn't expected to be summoned so soon, but he brushed aside any concerns, assuming the meeting would merely confirm what he already knew. Lily's fortune was his now. "Of course," he replied smoothly, his mind already envisioning the life of luxury and freedom that awaited him. The following morning, Ethan arrived at the courthouse with confidence, dressed impeccably and exuding the air of a man accustomed to privilege. This, he assumed, would be a mere formality, a confirmation of the wealth he was set to inherit. But as he entered the room, he noticed someone unexpected. Ben Harper, Lily's favorite nephew, seated calmly across the table from Wallace. Ben's presence was unsettling. Lily had often treated him like a son, and his lack of surprise at being here prickled at Ethan's nerves. Still, he forced a polite smile and took his seat, focusing on the lawyer as Wallace shuffled some papers and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," Wallace began, his tone more somber than Ethan anticipated. "There have been some last-minute changes to Mrs. Johnson's will." Ethan's confidence faltered for a split second, his mind racing as he wondered what Wallace meant by last minute. He listened intently, waiting for the confirmation of his newfound fortune. But then the words hit him like a blow. Mrs. Johnson revised her will just days before her passing. She has decided to donate 60% of her estate to various charities. Ethan's breath caught, and he gripped the arms of his chair, struggling to maintain his composure as the news sank in. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was his inheritance, his reward, slipping out of reach. Glancing across the table, Ethan's gaze fell on Ben, who sat with a quiet, almost satisfied look, as though he had expected this outcome all along. The steady calm in Ben's expression made Ethan's stomach twist. Did Ben know something he didn't? Had he somehow influenced Lily's decision? A ripple of tension settled between them, and for the first time, Ethan felt his carefully laid plans crumble. As Wallace continued outlining the will's terms, Ethan barely heard him, his thoughts now filled with a mixture of anger, confusion, and suspicion. This was more than just an unexpected twist, it was a threat to everything he'd counted on, and as he glanced once more at Ben, a bitter realization crept in. His nephew wasn't just a spectator in this. He was a player, one who knew far more than he let on. As they left the courthouse, Ethan seized the opportunity to confront Ben, his polished mask slipping to reveal the frustration simmering underneath. He reached out, catching Ben's shoulder just as he was about to step away. "Did you know about this, Ben?" Ethan's voice was low but laced with tension. "This last-minute change? It just seems a bit sudden, don't you think?" Ben turned to face him, his expression calm and steady, as if he'd been expecting this very question. For a moment, they stared at each other, and Ethan could feel his pulse quicken with irritation. Ben's calmness felt almost smug, as though he held some knowledge Ethan was not privy to. "She had her reasons," Ben replied quietly, his words measured and deliberate. "Aunt Lily was a thoughtful woman. She always considered what was best in the long run." His tone was gentle, but the underlying message stung Ethan, hinting that perhaps Lily's change in the will was meant to protect something, or someone, other than him. The ambiguity in Ben's response made Ethan's stomach twist with suspicion. He'd known that Lily and Ben had always been close, but the idea that Ben could have held such sway over her final decisions felt both unsettling and, in this moment, deeply infuriating. Ethan's mind churned as he absorbed Ben's words, searching for any hint of betrayal or hidden motives in the younger man's steady gaze. The unspoken implications felt like barbs, poking at the cracks in his confidence. Could Ben have somehow convinced Lily to change her will, robbing him of what he had been counting on? The realization sent a hot wave of resentment through him. He had always seen Ben as little more than a nephew to Lily, an affectionate but inconsequential figure in the grander scheme of her life and legacy. But now, seeing him here, so composed and seemingly in control, Ethan felt a pang of jealousy and anger. What if Lily had trusted Ben in ways she had never trusted him? What if Ben had the influence he'd always assumed was his alone? As Ben turned to leave, his cryptic smile lingering, Ethan clenched his jaw, the bitterness of the encounter burning in his chest. This was more than just a will. This was a power struggle he hadn't anticipated, one that left him feeling shaken and far less certain of his standing in Lily's world. The tension following the courthouse meeting had barely settled when Ethan's phone buzzed with a new message. Glancing down, he froze, feeling a jolt of panic as he read the words. The message was short and direct. Any attempt to challenge Lily's will would result in the exposure of his affair with Rachel. The threat was unmistakable and left little room for doubt. Someone knew about their relationship and was prepared to use it as a weapon. A wave of dread coursed through him as he forwarded the message to Rachel, who replied almost instantly with a call. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Rachel's tone was laced with fear, her usual confidence shattered. The dream of wealth she'd been so close to grasping now seemed to be slipping through her fingers, and her desperation seeped through the line. Ethan's mind spun, racing through possibilities as he tried to keep his own panic under control. They needed information, something solid to help them understand who was behind this threat. There was only one person he could think of who might be able to help. Marcus Lee, an old mentor from his early career, now a retired detective with a knack for uncovering the hidden truths people tried to bury. After a tense call, Marcus agreed to help, though his tone was reserved, and Ethan could tell he was wary of the tangled mess he was stepping into. "I'll see what I can find out," Marcus had said. "But remember, secrets like these have a way of surfacing, whether we like it or not." As days passed without word from Marcus, Rachel's anxiety grew, and her once steady composure gave way to visible cracks. Every time they met, she seemed more on edge, her eyes darting around, as though the walls themselves might betray them. Her hopes for a life of luxury were dwindling, and Ethan could feel the weight of her disappointment and fear bearing down on him. Each day brought more questions, and the shadow of the blackmail threat loomed over them both. With Rachel's steady unraveling and Marcus's cautious investigation, Ethan found himself trapped, his once solid plans dissolving in the face of secrets he could no longer control. A few days later, Marcus called Ethan to meet him at a secluded cafe, his tone unusually serious. Sitting across from his old mentor, Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine as Marcus laid out a file on the table. "Ethan," Marcus began quietly, "Lily knew about the affair." Ethan's breath caught as he absorbed the revelation. He had thought he'd hidden his secret well, but Lily, the woman he'd underestimated, had discovered everything. "She hired an investigator months ago," Marcus continued, tapping the file. "Lily wasn't as clueless as you thought. She wanted the truth, and she got it, down to the smallest details." Ethan flipped through the pages, his mind swirling with the realization that Lily had been one step ahead of him, watching his every move with a quiet resolve he hadn't noticed. The sting of betrayal was now turning back on him, a twisted reminder of the consequences he'd never anticipated. But Marcus's expression grew even graver as he took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto Ethan's with a look of pity mixed with warning. "There's more. Rachel. She has a history." Ethan's stomach tightened as Marcus explained. Rachel wasn't just an ambitious secretary. She had a pattern, a history of seducing powerful, wealthy men and leaving them in ruin once she'd gotten what she wanted. Each relationship had ended in scandal or financial disaster for the men involved, while Rachel walked away unscathed. "She's done this before, Ethan. She's used men just like you." Marcus's words were blunt, piercing through Ethan's defenses like a blade. For the first time, Ethan saw Rachel in a new, unsettling light. Memories replayed in his mind, her carefully timed glances, the way she'd been quick to latch onto his ambitions, her insistence on secrecy. He realized now that her attraction had been strategic, her loyalty conditional. She had likely seen him as a stepping stone, just another target in her calculated path. And Lily, she'd seen it too. She hadn't just been protecting her estate. She had been shielding herself from the fallout of Ethan's choices. The truth settled heavily on him. Both Lily and Rachel had known far more than he'd ever assumed. He'd been blind, manipulated from the very beginning, and now the consequences of his actions were staring back at him, inescapable and painfully clear. Later that night, Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. He arranged to meet Rachel in the dimly lit corner of a cafe they frequented. She arrived, smiling softly at him, but her expression faltered as she saw the cold, determined look on his face. Without a word, he slid the file across the table, watching her face as she opened it and scanned the pages. Her confident smile vanished, replaced by something sharper and harder as she realized he knew everything. About her history with other men, the pattern of seduction and destruction she'd woven long before him. "So," he said quietly, his voice tight with anger and humiliation. "This was all just another game to you?" Rachel closed the file and met his gaze, her own eyes glinting with defiance. "I never forced you to do anything, Ethan," she replied calmly, unflinching under his glare. "You wanted this as much as I did." But as she spoke, her tone shifted and her eyes narrowed. "But let's be clear," she continued, leaning forward. "If you don't fight this will, if you don't contest it and take back what's yours, I'll make sure everyone knows about us. Your reputation, your career, it'll all go up in smoke. Do you really think you can just walk away?" Ethan felt a chill run through him, but instead of fear, a quiet resolve began to settle in. Looking at Rachel now, he saw her manipulation in full light, the way she'd twisted his ambition and desires for her own gain. Her threat stung, but it no longer had the power it once might have. For too long, he had let his choices be guided by greed, by selfishness, and by people like Rachel who mirrored his own flaws back at him. But now, in this moment, he felt something change. "This is over," he said firmly, standing up and looking down at her with a new clarity. "Do whatever you want. I'm done playing your games." Without another glance, he walked away, leaving Rachel behind, her threats and ambitions trailing into silence. For the first time, Ethan felt he was stepping out of the shadows he'd created and towards something he could genuinely call redemption. The next day, Ethan reached out to Ben, requesting a meeting. They met in a quiet, empty park where the sounds of the city faded into the background. Ethan approached slowly, his usual confidence replaced by a sense of humility he hadn't felt in years. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but laced with regret. "I know I've done things I'm not proud of," he admitted, looking Ben directly in the eyes. "I know I hurt Lily. I took her for granted and I made choices that led to this mess. But I want to make things right. I want to honor her the way she deserved. Let me help with her plans, the charities, the foundations. I want to be part of what she started." Ben studied him carefully, his face unreadable. Ethan could sense Ben's hesitation, the years of distrust standing between them. After a long pause, Ben finally spoke, his tone calm but firm. "If I agree to this, it's on my terms. One slip, one sign that you're back to your old ways, and this is over. I won't let you undo everything Lily worked for." The weight of Ben's words settled heavily on Ethan, but he nodded without hesitation. He knew this was his only chance, not just to prove himself to Ben, but to find his own path to redemption. "I understand," he replied, his voice steady. "I swear, I'll honor Lily's wishes. I'll put her plans first, no matter what." Ben seemed to consider his words, his expression softening ever so slightly. With a reluctant nod, he extended his hand, and Ethan shook it firmly. It was a gesture of trust, but also of accountability, a promise Ethan knew he couldn't afford to break. As they parted ways, Ethan felt a strange but profound sense of purpose settle within him. This wasn't about money or reputation anymore. It was about redemption, about finally stepping out of the shadows he had created and making something meaningful from the life Lily had left behind. A few days later, Ethan made the bold and public decision to withdraw his challenge to Lily's will, allowing her final wishes to stand unchallenged. The news spread quickly through San Francisco's high society, igniting a storm of gossip and speculation. Whispers floated through elegant dinner parties and upscale gatherings, with everyone weighing in on his sudden change of heart. Some viewed it as an act of surrender, while others saw it as a strategic move. Only a few dared to suggest that perhaps Ethan Carter had changed. But Ethan was no longer concerned with what people thought. For once, he wasn't looking at the world through the lens of reputation or social standing. He was looking toward something much larger, Lily's legacy, and the meaningful difference he could make through it. Rachel, however, wasn't about to let him walk away that easily. Furious over the turn of events and her diminishing access to the wealth she'd craved, she tried to retaliate by leaking the story of their affair to the press. Her plan, however, was swiftly and quietly blocked. Ben, fully aware of Rachel's schemes, used his own connections to silence the story before it gained traction. Rachel's attempt to undermine Ethan's reputation was thwarted, and with it, her influence over him faded into nothingness. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a true sense of freedom, unburdened by secrets and manipulation. With his mind clear and his purpose renewed, Ethan threw himself fully into Lily's philanthropic projects. He began by funding schools in underprivileged areas, giving children access to the education Lily had always valued. Next came healthcare clinics, which provided essential medical care to those who could not afford it. He didn't stop there, launching small business programs aimed at helping struggling entrepreneurs get back on their feet. Each project was a reflection of Lily's values, a tangible symbol of the life she had lived and the dreams she had cherished. As the months went by, the city's view of Ethan began to shift. The man who had once been labeled a greedy widower was now seen in a different light, a figure of genuine compassion and purpose. People began to speak of him with a newfound respect, admiring his dedication to the causes Lily had championed. Slowly, he shed the tarnished reputation he had once earned, replacing it with one grounded in generosity and integrity. For Ethan, the transformation felt like a second chance, not only at life, but at becoming someone worthy of the legacy he was now determined to protect. Months after he had first stood at Lily's grave, wrapped in his own hidden motives, Ethan returned to the quiet cemetery, but this time as a different man. The air was still, the sounds of the city distant, as he stood alone before Lily's headstone. He placed a small bouquet of lilies on her grave, their delicate petals stark against the cold stone. For a long moment, he simply stood there, taking in the reality of everything that had come to pass. "I'm sorry, Lily," he murmured, his voice raw with a sincerity he hadn't known before. "For everything I did, for every promise I broke, every selfish choice. I'm sorry that it took losing you to understand what really mattered." He felt a weight lifting, not from making excuses, but from finally acknowledging the truth of his failures. As he stood in silent reflection, he heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Ben joining him. Ben nodded quietly, standing by his side, and after a moment of silence, he spoke. "You've changed, Ethan," he said, his tone softer than Ethan had ever heard before. "She'd be proud of what you're doing now. I didn't think you had it in you, honestly. But you've proved me wrong." Ethan felt a surge of gratitude for Ben's words, knowing they held a respect that had been hard-won. It was as though, in Ben's eyes, he was no longer just the man who had once betrayed Lily's trust, but someone worthy of the life she had envisioned. Ethan looked down at Lily's headstone, recalling a moment long ago when she had told him that true wealth wasn't measured by what one had, but by what one gave. He hadn't understood her then, but now, after dedicating himself to her projects and seeing the lives he could change, he finally understood. Her wealth had never been about money. It had been about compassion, generosity, and impact. He was only beginning to grasp the value of a life spent giving rather than taking. As he left the cemetery, Ethan felt a quiet but powerful peace settling within him. He had found what Lily had tried to teach him all along, that real wealth was not in riches, but in a life spent with purpose and integrity. And for the first time, he felt ready to honor her legacy, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine commitment to the values she had lived by. As Ethan and Ben walked side by side away from Lily's grave, the cemetery behind them, Ethan felt a profound sense of closure settle over him. It was as if he was leaving behind the final remnants of his old self, the man who had once been driven by greed and ambition, blind to the true wealth in front of him. With each step, he felt lighter, as though he were stepping into a new life, one marked not by secrets or schemes, but by purpose and redemption. He glanced at Ben, feeling an unspoken gratitude for the man who had once been his rival and now stood as both witness and partner in the life he was committed to building. As they reached the cemetery gates, Ethan paused, taking one last look back. He made a quiet promise to himself and to Lily that he would carry on her legacy not just in name, but in spirit. He would live by her values of generosity, compassion, and integrity, finding fulfillment in the act of giving rather than taking. He knew now that his life would be devoted to the causes she cared for so deeply, the schools, clinics, and programs that would make a difference for those in need. He would honor her memory by continuing the work she had started, letting her vision live on through his hands. As they stepped out onto the street, the sun began its slow descent over San Francisco, casting the city in warm shades of gold and amber. The glow of the sunset reflected the new beginning that awaited him, the light both an ending and a beginning, symbolizing the journey that had transformed him. For Ethan, this was more than the close of a chapter. It was a rebirth. He had found his redemption not in wealth but in living by the principles Lily had always held dear. With Ben at his side, he walked forward into the embrace of a life truly worth living, knowing that he was finally on the path that Lily would have been proud of. Subscribe for more interesting videos.